I'm Jim Stanford. I'm an economist, and I work for Unifor, Canada's largest union in the private sector. The biggest argument you run into with any campaign to raise the minimum wage is the claim by small business owners and other lobbyists that if you do that, you'll eliminate thousands and thousands of jobs. They'll say you'll actually hurt the people that you're trying to help, that young people and others who often work for minimum wages will be priced out of the market and they'll become unemployed. So this is a long-standing claim. There's a lot of debate in economic literature about whether that argument is valid or not. And we decided to test the argument by looking at historical data from Canada's labour market going back to 1983 to see if we could find any empirical evidence that higher minimum wages hurt your chances of finding a job. Well, the traditional arguments you hear are that labor is like anything else in the world. If it costs more, you'll buy less of it. You know, if the price of widescreen TVs goes up, well, you'll be less likely to buy a widescreen TV. And the same argument, they say, applies to workers. If workers are more expensive, then employers will buy less of them. That argument's very flawed because no company buys a worker just for the sake of having a worker around. They buy a worker, or in essence hire a worker, pay them for their labor, because they want that person to produce something that they're then going to sell to consumers who are demanding whatever it is that the company is producing. So employers never use labor for its own sake. In economic terminology, the demand for labor is derived based on how much demand there is for the product that the workers are producing. So the traditional idea that just increasing wages means you're going to hire less workers is actually not theoretically valid. And we wanted to test whether there was any empirical evidence for it as well. Well, we went looking for any empirical evidence that higher minimum wages hurt employment with a very, very broad net, if you like. We looked at historical data in Canada from all 10 provinces, so 10 different provinces, going back to 1983. And we considered 7 different labor market indicators in each of those 10 provinces, including rates of employment growth, unemployment. We looked at employment indicators for young people, and we also looked in particular low-wage sectors like retail and hospitality. So we cast the net very, very widely looking for empirical evidence, and in essence we didn't find any. We conducted a series of 70 different statistical regressions on the economic data, and in 90% of the cases we found no connection whatsoever between higher minimum wages and employment levels. And in the remaining cases, the remaining 10%, the evidence was split. In half of the cases we found that higher minimum wages actually helped employment, and in the other half they seemed to hurt employment. But the overwhelming finding was that minimum wages are irrelevant to employment. And that shouldn't be surprising because, again, when an employer hires someone, it's not for its own sake. They're hiring them to produce something that they want to sell. And what really drives employment is whether there's purchasing power in the economy to buy the stuff that workers make. Well, we also included in our statistical investigations a measure of the purchasing power of the consumer market, if you like, proxied by the level of economic growth in each of the provinces that we studied. And consistently we found that the level of purchasing power, or the demand, if you like, for what workers produce was a strong and dominant explanation of how many new jobs were created. So if the purchasing power is out there and people have money to spend, businesses will meet that demand and they will hire workers to produce the goods and services that they're selling. That's the very strong evidence. Anything that affects the level of purchasing power in the Canadian economy will affect employment levels. That could include government policies around budgets and austerity. It could include how strongly businesses are investing to grow their production. It could include our exports and how well our exports are doing based on the dollar, based on the state of the world economy. It can even include, and this is interesting, wages themselves. Remember, most Canadians depend on wages for their spending power. So paying higher wages to somebody might look bad for a business, but think about it. It means that those workers, and hopefully millions more as well, have got more money to spend. And particularly in sectors like hospitality and retail, they're totally dependent on consumer spending power. So that's where higher wages, including higher minimum wages, can actually help business more than it hurts them. BC's got a very bad record at lagging behind the rest of the country on minimum wages. Of course, the minimum wage was frozen here for many years. Then the government finally increased it a bit, but now they're lagging behind again. And that really undermines the living standards of low-wage workers, not just those working for the legal minimum itself, but even people who work for wages that are slightly higher than the minimum wage. Their wages tend to follow the minimum wage. So if there's no change in the minimum wage, then people who are making a little bit above the minimum wage don't get a raise either. So there's lots of BC workers whose incomes have been stagnant because the minimum wage hasn't been increased. That undermines their quality of life. It also undermines spending power. It undermines tax revenues for the provincial government. All kinds of social economic damage that comes from the failure to increase the minimum wage here. There's lots of debate, of course, in terms of what is an appropriate target to aim for with the minimum wage. Clearly, it has to be higher than it is. We'd certainly like to see the minimum wage be high enough to take someone past the poverty line. I mean, surely work should get you out of poverty. Work shouldn't keep you trapped in poverty. Unfortunately, decisions around changing the minimum wage tend to be pretty ad hoc, and they tend to be quite politicized, based on, however a government feels the winds are blowing in any given year. Are they going to be listening more to workers who aren't making enough money, or are they going to be listening to businesses who are saying, no, 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 keep the wages as low as possible? So that ad hoc nature is one of the problems. So at a minimum, we clearly need to have annual increases in the minimum wage at least to keep up with consumer price inflation. But even that's not enough. If the minimum wage is really low to start with, then indexing it to inflation just keeps it low in real spending power terms. So at a minimum, we should be adjusting it upward every year. And then hopefully we should have larger adjustments on top of inflation to reflect the fact that the minimum wage is too low to start with. Freezing wages, especially for the lowest paid people in society, isn't going to create any work. In fact, it will undermine employment precisely because it hurts spending power among consumers here. If you were serious about reducing unemployment, then you got to look at that issue of the overall level of purchasing power in our economy. And government can do a lot directly and indirectly to get more money flowing through the economy, more spending power, and more job creation. So they can start with their own budgets. Instead of laying off thousands of civil servants and cutting public services, they should be growing them. We clearly need more public investment in infrastructure, public transit, other types of infrastructure that we've ignored for years. We also need, I think, more successful business strategies in some of our key industries. Instead of just cutting corporate taxes and hoping that companies will expand, that hasn't worked very well. We should have more proactive strategies in some of our key industries, like resources, so that we add value to our resources here instead of just exporting raw extracted product. In some of our value-added industries, high-value service industries, tourism, etc. There's a lot that government can do to foster more job creation in those sectors as well.